Hello, I'm continuing my reviews on the Exorcist series with The Exorcist III. Now, The Exorcist III came out in 1990, and the film is written and directed by William Peter Blatty. Now, this is based on William Peter Blatty's 1983 novel, Legion. Now, I have read the book, and I'm going to address some of the major differences between the movie and the book later on in this review. Now, the novel Legion was actually the third book in William Peter Blatty's Faith trilogy, which began with the novel The Exorcist and continued with the Ninth Configuration and then Legion. Now, The Exorcist III is also the third film in the Exorcist series. However, it acts as a direct sequel to the original The Exorcist, and it completely ignores the continuity of Exorcist II: The Heretic, which William Peter Blatty had nothing to do with. Now, between the novel version of The Exorcist and the novel Legion, which this movie is based on, William Peter Blatty wrote a novel called The Ninth Configuration, which is actually kind of set in the same universe as The Exorcist. However, it's not a horror story. Now, I actually have done a review on the book The Ninth Configuration a couple of years ago, and The Ninth Configuration was actually made into a movie in 1980, and once again, The Ninth Configuration is kind of set in the same universe as The Exorcist. Like, it features one of the same characters, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about The Ninth Configuration at the end of this review, because I feel like The Ninth Configuration is worth a mention, because, once again, it is set in the same universe as The Exorcist. Now, The Exorcist III is an underrated classic, in my opinion, and it's also one of the most underrated sequels of all time. Like, I love this movie. Now, it's not a flawless movie, but a lot of the flaws that this movie has were actually studio interference, but I'll get a little bit more in-depth with the studio interference later on in this review. But once again, The Exorcist III is a really, really good movie. And one of the things I really do love about this movie is it doesn't just try to repeat the same plotline as the original film. Like, it's actually radically different from the original The Exorcist, while still staying true to a lot of the themes that The Exorcist touched on. And another thing that I really do love about this movie is it is a really creepy horror film, but there's also a lot of humor in this movie. But it's not humor like comedy humor, it's more of, I guess you can say, a naturalistic kind of humor. Like, it's the kind of humor that you can see real people making, even in a situation like the situation that the characters in this movie get in. Like, once again, it's a very naturalistic kind of humor, or realistic comedy in a way. Like, once again, it's humor that you can see real people making. And that's one thing that I actually think William Peter Blatty is really good at. If you see this movie, and if you see The Ninth Configuration, Blatty is really good at creating genuinely funny characters and putting them in what is supposed to be a serious movie, yet still making it believable. Now, the plot of The Exorcist III is it follows the character of Bill Kinderman, who was a minor character in The Exorcist. However, in this movie, he's the main character. Now, Lieutenant Kinderman in The Exorcist was played by Lee J. Cobb. Unfortunately, Lee J. Cobb was dead at this point, so George C. Scott plays Lieutenant Kinderman in this movie, and personally, and this is not meant to be disrespectful to Lee J. Cobb, but personally, I think George C. Scott plays the character of Lieutenant Bill Kinderman so much better than Lee J. Cobb did. But in the movie, Kinderman, who is a homicide detective, starts investigating a series of murders which bear a very eerie parallel with the murders of a serial killer known as the Gemini Killer, who died years before the events of this movie. And Kinderman is not the kind of person who necessarily believes in the supernatural. You're not even sure what exactly his religious beliefs are. You kind of get the idea that he might be an agnostic, and I'll get a little bit more into what Kinderman's views are later on in this review. But once again, Kinderman is not the kind of person who necessarily believes in the supernatural, but he eventually discovers that the spirit of the Gemini Killer has actually come back from hell and is now taking possession of different people and using these people as puppets to carry out his work for him. But the Gemini Killer is primarily possessing this one particular patient in the psychiatric ward of this hospital. And this is a minor spoiler, but in the movie you find out that this patient that the Gemini Killer is possessing is actually Damien Karras, who was one of the main characters of the original film. But Damien Karras was believed to have died at the end of the first movie, but somehow Damien Karras has come back from the dead, only now he's being possessed by the Gemini Killer. Now, this film actually has a pretty impressive cast. As I said, George C. Scott plays Lieutenant Kinderman in the film and does a phenomenal job in this movie as the character of Bill Kinderman. In the movie, Ed Flanders, who worked with Blatty before on the 9th Configuration, he plays the character of Father Dyer in this movie. Now, Father Dyer was a character from the original film, however, he was played by a different actor in the original film, but Ed Flanders does do a really good job in this film as the character of Father Dyer. The movie also has Scott Wilson in it, who most people would know as Herschel from The Walking Dead, but Scott Wilson in this movie plays a character named Dr. Temple. Now, this is also not the first time that Scott Wilson worked with Blatty. Scott Wilson also worked with Blatty on the film The 9th Configuration, the same as Ed Flanders. There are also some really interesting cameos in this movie. In the film, there's actually a cameo appearance from Larry King, and there's also a cameo appearance from Samuel Jackson. However, this was really before Samuel Jackson became famous. Like, in the film, there's this scene where Kinderman has this really bizarre dream, and Samuel Jackson plays one of the people that Kinderman sees in this dream. In the movie, Jason Miller reprises his role as Damien Karras, even though it's technically not Damien, because once again, it's the Gemini Killer only using Damien's body, but Jason Miller does a great job in this movie as the possessed Karras. Now, in the movie, Brad Dourif plays the Gemini Killer, and Brad Dourif's performance as the Gemini Killer in this movie is definitely one of the best villain performances of all time, in my opinion. And his performance in this movie is by far the standout performance of this film. And as much as I do love this movie, I will admit that Brad Dourif is probably the best part of this film. Like, Brad Dourif's performance as this character is one of the most shit-your-pants, scary performances of a villain I've ever seen put to film. And Brad Dourif is already an underrated actor, but I would say his performance in this film is definitely one of his most underrated performances. Now, I think I've already established that I really do love this movie, but there are a lot of problems with this movie, but I would say this movie's biggest problem is studio interference, and this film suffered from a lot of studio interference. For example, there are a lot of points of this movie where it does feel like scenes were cut out, and also this film originally wasn't even going to be called Exorcist III. It was originally going to be called Legion, which was the title of the novel, but when Morgan Creek, who is the company that put this movie out, when they found out that this was connected to The Exorcist, they insisted that it be called Exorcist III, and this is a minor spoiler, but there is an exorcism scene at the end of the film, and you could tell that scene was just tacked on, because originally there was going to be no exorcism scene, but Morgan Creek insisted that Blatty put an exorcism scene at the end of the film, and once again, it just feels so tacked on. Also, there's one particular scene in this movie that is actually really, really gory. Now, don't get me wrong, I love gore, but this is not the kind of horror film that needed gore. This is really a psychological horror film, and once again, it's not the kind of film that really needed or relied on gore, but there's one particular scene in this film that is actually pretty horrifically gory, and it really does feel like that was studio interference. So that's the biggest problem with this film, is this film suffered from a lot of studio interference. But despite this movie's flaws, for me the positives outweigh the negatives in this movie, and for me there is a lot to love about this film. For one, the atmosphere in this film is amazing. Like, William Peter Blatty does such a brilliant job in this movie at creating mood and atmosphere, and it is a really creepy horror film, but despite the fact that it is a really creepy horror film, there is a lot of genuine humor in this movie as well, but as I said before, the humor in this film is a very naturalistic kind of humor. Like, the character of Lieutenant Kinderman is a genuinely funny character, but you get the idea that the reason he's such a funny character is it's almost like he's using his sense of humor as like a coping mechanism for all the horrible things that he sees, because this guy is a homicide detective, so he sees the worst of humanity on a daily basis, so you really do get the idea that his sense of humor is once again a coping mechanism for all the horrible things that he has to deal with. And truth be told, that's where a lot of humor comes from. Humor is really a coping mechanism in a lot of ways to get us through our daily lives, and of course we're not all homicide detectives. We don't all see the horrible things that humans are capable of on a daily basis unless you watch the news every day, but once again, the world can be a really horrible place, and humor really is the thing that humor, once again, it's a coping mechanism, and that's where the humor in this film comes from. It's a naturalistic kind of humor. And also, a lot of the dialogue in this movie between Kinderman and Father Dyer is freaking hilarious. Now, one of the main themes of this film really is the nature of good and evil in humanity, and throughout the film, Kinderman constantly wonders, like, why people do evil things, and is it really the work of the devil? Like, is the devil the reason that humans can be so cruel to each other, or is it just human nature? And throughout the film, Kinderman, like, you don't really know exactly what Kinderman's beliefs are, but it appears that he might be at least an agnostic. Like, it almost appears that he acknowledges that God could exist, but you really do get the idea that he's angry with God for letting evil exist in the world, and really the idea of this film is how does the concept of evil fit in with God's plan. Now, you get a lot more insight into Kinderman's philosophical views in the book, which this movie is based on, and this movie does change quite a bit from the book, but it does stay true to the general themes of the book. But once again, the book gets a lot more detailed into what exactly Kinderman's views and beliefs are, and also in the book, Kinderman has this really interesting theory that I like to call the Lucifer theory. Basically, Kinderman's Lucifer theory is that what if the Big Bang was actually caused by Lucifer being cast out of heaven, and basically the whole idea of his theory is, what if the same way that God is within all of us, what if a little piece of Lucifer is within all of us as well, and that explains the nature of good and evil in man. Like, basically the whole idea of his theory is that God and the devil are within all of us, and it's up to us whether to do good or whether to do evil. And it was a really interesting theory in the book, and I actually kind of wished that they would have brought that theory up in the movie at some point. The movie also leaves out a lot of characters who were in the book, and also characters who had bigger roles to play in the book end up being reduced to side characters in the movie. But once again, because this film had such studio interference, it's hard to say how true or untrue the original version of this film was to the book. Now, before I end this review, I just want to briefly touch on the 1980 film, The Ninth Configuration, which also goes by the title Twinkle Twinkle Killer Kane. Now, The Ninth Configuration, the reason I'm not reviewing that, even though it is set in the same universe as The Exorcist, the reason I'm not reviewing it is because this is the month of October where I only review horror films, and The Ninth Configuration, despite the fact that it is connected to The Exorcist, Ninth Configuration is actually not a horror film. But The Ninth Configuration is still a great movie, and I highly recommend people go check that movie out, because it is a criminally underrated film, even more underrated than this film, because this film, at least a decent amount of people have heard of this film. It seems like The Ninth Configuration has kind of fallen into obscurity. Now, the connection between The Ninth Configuration and The Exorcist is, in The Exorcist, there was this scene where Chris McNeil was having this party at her house, and one of the guests at this party was an astronaut who was about to go to the moon, and that same character is actually one of the main characters of The Ninth Configuration, and in The Ninth Configuration you find out that his name is actually Billy Cutshaw. The Ninth Configuration also touches on a lot of the same themes that The Exorcist touched on, themes like the nature of good and evil in man, and the possible existence of God. But once again, if you haven't seen The Ninth Configuration, definitely try to check this movie out. But yeah, that was my review on The Exorcist III, which once again, I think is a great horror film and a really good follow-up to the original film. So if you haven't seen The Exorcist III, definitely check it out, and my next movie review will be Exorcist: The Beginning.